Right. Closer, is that all right? Brilliant. Right, everyone, good morning, thanks for coming. Just by way of an introduction of why we're here and what we're doing. So obviously in Wales, politically, there's storm clouds gathering in the form of the Senate elections. For the last 100 years, Labour has ruled in Wales, and it looks like they're going to fall to maybe third place. So the likelihood is that in May we're either going to have a Plaid or Reform government. And in some sense we can think of that Labour Plaid Reform as representative in some sense of different ways forward for Wales. We got Plaid with their independence, we have Labour as kind of a status quo devolved, and we can think of Reform as many Conservatives have now been talking in Wales of almost getting rid of the Senate altogether and rule of Wales directly from Westminster. So now, I think, more than in a long time, the national question really has come to the forefront in Wales. But one of the problems we have, or one of the things that we need to get right, is that what do we mean when we talk about the national question, independence or not? If Brexit has taught us anything, it's that it's really not a simple yes-no question. We can be independent in Wales, but will we be in the EU? Will we be in NATO? Will we have a currency union? Will we be in the Eurozone? You can ask two people who are both pro-independence and they'll have very different answers to these questions. So to kind of kick us off in the morning, the first thing we're going to do is we'll have Fionn Wallace give us kind of a case study in this in the form of Ireland. So Ireland, like Wales, would be, if independent, would be kind of a small nation in the periphery of a larger Britain, within the Euro sphere of influence, within the American sphere of influence. Ireland is in the Eurozone and all the opportunities and problems that come with that. It's officially neutral, but it's still used as a refueling stop for the American army. So I think that gives a good context of, we can talk about independence, but what will that mean in the context of the world we live in? And then the second session will be more the straight discussion of independence versus progressive federalism, which is the Communist Party's view on the national question. And we'll have Luke Fletcher and Rick Newnham on that one. And then finally, to kind of bring it back to earth, we'll have, or not bring it back to earth, but to put it in a more immediate context, we'll have Alex Gordon and Roger McKenzie talking about, patriotism and nationalism and the rise of the far right. Now, I think in Wales we like to think of nationalism as a bit more of a left-wing concept, but we see in England and stuff how quickly nationalism can devolve into more racist elements. So I think that's something that needs to be brought in mind as well. But I think that's it from me. Happy to open this up to Laura. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't think Sid said he organized it, but I think he should have a special applause to organize the whole day today. Okay, so yes, Fionn Wallace is going to talk on, would the Republic of Ireland be a model for an independent Wales to follow? So Fionn is a member of the Communist Party of Ireland. He's a political analyst and activist with over a decade of experience working as a political researcher and speechwriter in Dáil Éireann and the European Parliament. Fionn holds a degree in history and philosophy and a master's in philosophy from University College of Dublin. Welcome, Fionn.
So thanks for those introductions. Thanks to the Welsh Communist Party for having me here to speak today, and special thanks to Dominic and Sandra for hosting me. My name is Fionn Wallace. My experience is working in the Irish Parliament, or Dáil Éireann in Oscailga, from 2012 to 2019, and then I went over to Brussels to the European Parliament from 2019 to 2024, where I worked exclusively on the Foreign Affairs and Security and Defence committees. Since May, Niamh na Breen from Transnational Institute and myself have been travelling around the 32 counties of Ireland, doing public education events about the threat to Irish neutrality coming from the Dublin government. We did our 42nd roadshow event this Wednesday. Today's subject of discussion is, would the Republic of Ireland be a model for an independent Wales to follow? In a nutshell, no. And I will explain why through the prism of Irish neutrality. And I'll start by saying that the framing of this discussion is problematic. The Republic of Ireland, as laid out in the title, refers to a 26-county jurisdiction that was violently severed from the 6 counties still under British rule. It is a republic that any Republican would reject. It is a colonialist construct. As a brief history lesson, Ireland was under British rule for centuries. In 1920, the island was partitioned with 6 counties set to remain under British rule, and 26 counties eventually becoming the Irish Free State in 2022, swearing allegiance to the British Crown. In 1949, the 26 counties formally became a republic. This is not the republic we fought for or want, and so I would never consider that an incomplete, partitioned republic should ever be a model for Welsh independence. The struggle must be one for full independence and sovereignty and the creation of a 32-county socialist republic free of British rule, but also free of EU and US influence. So this issue of neutrality exposes so many contradictions about Ireland, the role we play in the world, the sorry state of our bourgeois democracy, our sovereignty in the context of our EU membership, and our, for lack of a better word, special relationship with the United States and Britain. For some brief context that I will explore more fully later, Irish neutrality has been chipped away at for decades by successive governments and is now under threat in an existential way. The government is under pressure from the EU and NATO in the process of moving legislation that will dismantle a long-standing policy that governs the deployment of Irish troops overseas called the Triple Lock. This mechanism ensures that any deployment of more than 12 Irish troops abroad must have a United Nations mandate. It is the last protection for Irish neutrality, and without it, we open up the possibility of Irish defence forces being sent to fight and die in illegal imperialist wars and interventions initiated by the EU or NATO outside the UN mandate system. So the question becomes, why is the government so willing to have us abandon our neutrality and throw in our lot with the EU and NATO with the access of genocide? So Comrade Tommy McKierney addressed this when he wrote in the Socialist Voice in April last year, quote, "It is the US-led promotion of untrammeled free market capitalism that ultimately motivates the Irish ruling class's desire to be immersed in what is often referred to as the Washington Consensus. To maintain its standing within this neoliberal compact, our comprador bourgeoisie hope to ingratiate themselves via any and every concession necessary up to and including surrender to imperialist militarism." So during the Neutrality Roadshow, we've had the pleasure to present alongside academics like Rory Rowan, Paddy Bresnahan, Karen Devine, and others who each have distinct takes on this question. While they each would agree, as I do with Comrade McKierney's analysis, they often provide a narrative history that tells just how structurally and ideologically deep this relationship between our elites and Western imperialism is. Paddy Bresnahan has an excellent new book out with Pat Brodie called From the Bog to the Cloud. In it, they dismantle so much mythology around why Ireland has the economy that it does. There is a story told by the likes of Irish Times columnist Fintan O'Toole about how Ireland's economic modernisation and entry into social and cultural modernity was initiated with the 1958 publication of T.K. Whitaker's white paper simply called Economic Development. This story begins with a failed import substitution project driven by nationalist and conservative Fianna Fáil, trying to reduce dependence on Britain. It is far-sighted bureaucrats like Whitaker who were wise enough to set Ireland on the path of export-orientated industrialisation and liberalisation. What this narrative leaves out is how Ireland's attempt to de-link from Britain was compromised from the beginning, in large part because of constant attempts by the Brits to sabotage the newly formed Free State and subsequently the Republic. The first governments were not only not radical, They were hampered by a comprador class determined to keep the existing dependent economic relations with Britain intact. At the time, this was large cattle farmers and their middlemen. Other colonial structural relations were left untouched. We maintained currency parity with the British pound until the 1970s. Private banks refused to issue loans at affordable rates, preferring to transfer funds to Britain instead. The state had no appetite to challenge this or exercise any restraint on private enterprise or pursue nationalisation of key industries. The peat extraction and energy production enterprise Bord na Móna was an exception to the rule. All this was compounded by a conservative civil service inherited from the colonial era. After the Second World War, US Marshall aid flowed into Ireland from 1948. It came as loans with serious strings attached, an early example of structural adjustment. The US encouraged industrial production for export. In the discussions around what would make Ireland eligible for the aid, the US insisted on the end of any kind of protectionism and opening the Irish economy to free trade, particularly with Europe. Here was the beginning, in 1948, of the US policy of using Ireland as a platform into more protected European markets. The Irish Development Agency, the IDA, was established in 1949 with lots of US guidance, and so began Ireland's history of dropping its pants for foreign investors in a race to the bottom of legal systems for sale to international capital. There's not time to go into it in more detail on this, but I would highly recommend you pick up the book when it comes out very shortly. He's kind of doing launches and stuff on the book at the moment. It builds on a bunch of other work, but it does a lot to explore the idea of Ireland as a state that effectively became a laboratory for neo-colonialism. As Kwame Nkrumah wrote in 1965, the essence of neo-colonialism is that the state which is subject to it is, in theory, independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from outside. And this brings us to the European Union. Ireland joined the European Economic Economy, the EEC, at the same time as England, Wales and Scotland in 1973. It became the European Union in 1993, following on from the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. It was framed as an economic, not a military union. The history of the drift away from the lofty founding principles of the bloc is too long to go into here, but it is really with the Nice and Lisbon treaties that the project fully morphs into a military one. We are at a place now where the drive to militarism across the bloc, supercharged by the Ukraine war, means there is simply no tolerance for neutral, independent, or even sovereign states in the European Union. The Russian invasion of Ukraine consolidated the control of the Atlanticist camp and NATO over the European Union. It was used to massively increase military spending, an agenda being pushed heavily by US empire that plays out through NATO as a tool of that imperial project. Political dissent and opposing views on the conflict and the advancing EU militarism were shut down. Talk of peace or diplomacy by political opposition figures got them denounced as agents of Russia or enemies of EU values, freedom and democracy and so on. 3.5 years later, and the war in Ukraine rages on, it was never really allowed to stop. One of the most striking examples of this was when NATO scuppered the peace deal nearly agreed between Kiev and Moscow in May 2022. The Russian threat seems to be being kept alive for as long as it takes and kept as visceral and real for as long as it takes to sever the EU from any possible future other than a fully militarized, economically broken vassal of the United States. Foreign policy is solely a member state competence in the EU, and yet the European Commission has been acting outside its remit, driven by President von der Leyen and the High Commissioner for Foreign Affairs, Kaja Kallas, who behave like the Atlanticist generals of the entire bloc. Although Article 41.2 of the EU Treaty prohibits the use of budget funds for military purposes, under von der Leyen's leadership, these unlawful practices have been permitted. Military spending is now reframed as an industrial measure or in the interest of competitiveness promotion. The number of EU and national laws that have been broken to get us to this point is evidence of what amounts to a slow motion coup by the military-industrial complex and NATO. There's always been pressure from NATO to spend more on weapons, but this second iteration of the Trump regime has a somewhat different dynamic. The calls to increase military spending are more like orders backed by economic threats. To understand what is happening here and dispel any notion that Trump and the US are abandoning the EU and NATO, it is instructive to look at the philosophy that drives at least a highly influential arm of the US administration today, and that is the philosophy of American conservative realism. Trump's choice for Undersecretary for now used to be defense policy, but now war policy, Elbridge Colby, is the main guy behind this thinking. He's a grandson of a former CIA director. He comes from very good stock. Colby argues that the evolving geopolitical reality has exposed US limitations. The US must recognize these limits to its capacity, and as such should avoid pursuing previous policies of full spectrum global dominance that came to the fore with Bush Jr., really. American primacism must be rejected in favor of a coalition of strong, like-minded allies. The US must focus its limited abilities on the real challenge to US interests, the People's Republic of China, and push allies to build their strengths, buy loads of US-made weapons, and look after their own spheres of interest in order to better facilitate the collective sabotage and containment of Chinese development. To sell these orders from Trump and NATO to the people of Europe, we are bombarded with narratives of endless threats to Ireland and the EU. The US is unreliable, Russia is under every bed, and China is off somewhere sharpening its knives in the wings. There is a climate of insecurity that can only be remedied by more militarism. This is in tandem with the EU rolling out various ambitious plans. In March this year, the EU Commission presented the Rearm Europe plan, which aims to get EU defence spending across the bloc up to 3.5% of GDP, or around 680 billion euros per year by 2030. Literally a month ago, it was 650 billion, but they've just revised it up an extra 30 in the most recent documents for some reason. Also announced was the SAFE program, a 150 billion loan fund for military procurement and investment. Another 1.5% of GDP rise in spending will go towards military-related expenditure. This will encompass research and development programs in universities and so on, and most significantly, military mobility, so investment in rail, road, bridges, and all the infrastructure you need to get all the big machinery and our armies to the front in record time. A massive recruitment drive is underway, and according to Commission documents, the goal is to increase standing armies across the EU by an additional 800,000 troops in the next 3 to 4 years. Effectively, the EU Commission is ensuring that by 2030, the EU will be spending 970 billion euros a year on war preparation. That is more than half what the entire EU bloc spends on healthcare at the moment. And Germany, there's a debate about conscription going on in Germany, where the most recent proposal is that, well, first of all, everybody of military age is being assessed for their kind of health and ability, and then they're talking about the possibility of introducing a lottery conscription system, which is absolutely terrifying. This is framed as prolonging the Ukraine war and ultimately preparing for a massive land war with Russia. The EU Commission White Paper on Defence Readiness 2030, also published earlier this year, makes this crystal clear. But the Ukraine war itself is creating multiple crises inside Europe. Debt is ballooning and the Russian sanctions have rebounded to hurt the EU. The Ukraine war costs $100 billion a year and the EU is increasingly footing that bill. Germany has amended its debt brake to free up 900 billion for military spending over the next 5 years, but simultaneously is telling its people it can no longer afford social services. France and England are on the verge of asking the IMF for bailout loans. Several member states have external debt of over 100% of GDP. And as everybody here is surely aware, the Ukraine war and loss of access to cheap Russian gas is deindustrializing the EU. Large-scale layoffs and factory closures continue. Germany lost more than 125,000 industrial jobs since August, primarily in the car industry. And I don't think people in Europe appreciate just how bad the situation is in Germany at the moment and how serious the implications of that are for the Eurozone more broadly. The response from the Commission to this economic crisis has been to propose deregulation measures, in particular to ditch environmental protection and digital safety regulations, effectively to sacrifice people's health and safety to increase corporate profits. What's new? To fund increased militarization, domestic spending will be cut. So austerity is effectively baked into the EU treaties, which make significant state investment or anything resembling socialist development models illegal in the EU. This permanent austerity is now compounded by a severe energy and cost of living crisis, and now a further round of austerity to militarize the EU. As Mark Rutte, the new NATO Secretary General, told the European Parliament earlier this year, quote, "On average, European countries easily spend up to a quarter of their national income on pensions, health and social security systems, and we only need a small fraction of that money to make defence much stronger." And this is not to mention the pandemic-related debt, which is due to start being paid back in 2029. So none of this is adding up financially, and there will be political costs. The question is who's going to capitalize on them. Reactionary forces are on the rise and already in power in Austria, Hungary, and Italy. US pressure to reach the 5% NATO spending target in order to avoid excessive tariffs means the political projects of the likes of Merz, Macron, and Starmer are committing political suicide by implementing deeply unpopular budget cuts. This is at a time of deprivation, economic crisis across Europe, and levels of inequality and material deprivation not seen since the 2008 crash. The far right in Germany, France, and Britain, and elsewhere are making huge gains by criticizing pro-war liberal internationalist forces and focusing on real domestic issues. For now, Ireland only manages to escape the extremes of the economic woes of our European neighbours because of windfall corporation tax receipts from US multinationals based there. Our long-standing dependence on this source of revenue is not only unethical, because we facilitate the theft of resources that are much needed by publics all over the world, particularly in the global south countries. It is also a high-risk strategy that both leaves us vulnerable to shifts in US policy and forfeits our sovereignty when it comes to domestic or international policy decisions that may upset the US. We have seen this dynamic and contradictions heightened significantly since the onset of the so-called global war on terror, and in particular with the NATO-orchestrated genocide in Gaza. Shannon has been provided for use as a US military forward air base, from which it has waged imperialist warfare, killing and maiming millions and displacing millions more. It has also been used in direct violation of international law for the transfer of weapons and munitions to the genocide in Gaza. We know now that the Occupied Territories Bill was stalled for 7 years and will likely never see the light of day in any form that has any teeth because of pressure from the US and Israel. Ireland's trade with Israel has increased from 198 million in 2020 to 3.24 billion in 2024, primarily because of our profit-shifting services. There are many ways in which Ireland is forfeiting its sovereignty while simultaneously further embedding us in the structures of empire. From the data center explosion that has us complicit in rapidly advancing AI warfare and mass surveillance, to the rapid expansion of dual-use technology production for empire's wars. While the term complicit indicates agency, the genocide in Gaza has deeply exposed just how diminished Irish sovereignty is. While Ireland is regarded by many as a vocal supporter of Palestine, of the Palestinian cause, and a critic of Israel, in reality nothing could be further from the truth. We have consistently allowed our airports and airspace to be used by NATO war machine for the transit of troops and weapons to the genocide. Our government twice voted down motions that would stop our central bank being the site of sale for issuing Israeli war bonds. We have been increasing trade with Israel to the point where our tiny country is our second biggest trading partner. And we have the aforementioned bill that would ban trade with the occupied territories that passed its first 2 stages and has been languishing in limbo since 2019. Sustained pressure and protest from the Irish public, who are fiercely in solidarity with Palestine, has forced the government to say and do the right things as long as they were merely performative. When it came to material measures like the Occupied Territories Bill, real threats came from the US to the effect that they would pull out their multinationals and use our tax haven services less. Nearly 1/5 of all US profit shifting for tax evasion happens in Ireland. We're at a crossroads where the choice about where we turn now is rapidly being undermined and taken away from us. The plan is for Ireland to follow Finland and Sweden, end our neutrality, and cozy up to NATO. The triple lock has to go, as it is the very last protection on our neutrality. It is all that stands in the way of the government sending our sons and daughters to fight and die in illegal wars that are being willed into existence by elites that support genocide as a matter of official policy and who have nothing to offer the people of Europe but immiseration and fear. And just to be crystal clear about what the government is proposing, if they get rid of the triple lock, the Minister of the Day will be allowed, with a whipped Dáil majority, to send a limitless number of Irish Defence Forces to fight and die in any EU or NATO-led intervention. Without the whipped Dáil majority, the Minister will be allowed to send up to 100 Defence Forces wherever they like, with no discussion beyond the government cabinet. This is all spelled out in the Defence Amendment Bill 2025, but in the mainstream discourse about this, no one ever asks these questions or discusses it in public. There is no democratic mandate for these moves by the Irish government. The Irish people rejected 2 referendums on the ratification of the EU treaties on the basis of fears that we would be dragged into EU military structures. Only when we got a special provision that specifically protected Irish neutrality in the context of these treaty reforms did the Irish people ratify the Nice and Lisbon treaties. Now the government is moving to change the policy, a policy that is as old as the state, without going back to the people. Dr. Karen Devine, her research has shown, she's basically studied every opinion poll going back to the early 80s up till today. And she shows, scientifically that all over that period, 4 out of 5 on average Irish people want to support a positive version of Irish neutrality. But in her research, she's also shown that our attachment to neutrality is deeply linked to our understanding of ourselves as a people and the importance we attach to independence. The government's anti-democratic attack on Irish neutrality will subordinate that independence to imperialist powers and endanger our defence forces. Our sons and daughters will be coming home maimed, traumatised, or in body bags for the interests of the same powers that are doing to Gaza today what the British did to the Irish in the mid-1800s. Our comprador politicians have no understanding of the concept of sovereignty, of independence, of our history, and what it means to be true to your roots. What we have effectively in Ireland at the moment is an unfinished revolution. The politicians in the Dáil are nothing more than managers working on behalf of domestic elites and foreign international capital. As long as these forces remain influential, even if we leave the EU, we will just run headlong into the arms of England or the US, who already have such entrenched financial interests on our island. Even the way the British establishment talks about Ireland, it is as if it is taken for granted that we have no sovereignty. There was an event in the House of Lords last month on the subject of Irish reunification. Rear Admiral Chris Parry, who's a Welshman apparently, was invited on to our national broadcaster to report its findings. He told a fawning interviewer that a united Ireland would pose a strategic threat to Britain, that we would effectively become an obstacle to Britain's ability to repel attacks from Russian and Chinese ships off the west coast of Ireland. That Britain needed a massive radar stationed in the west of Ireland, that Ireland should join NATO, have NATO bases and troops stationed on our island, have NATO exercises in the Irish economic zone off the west coast of Ireland to scare off the Chinese and Russians apparently, that neutrality was a strange idea, and that we needed to have a common defence and security policy between Britain and Ireland that addresses British security concerns. That any moves towards or talk of nuclear-free zones or any neutrality, quote-unquote, any neutrality, would upset British military plans. He then ended by joking with the presenter that that there was a lot of talent in Ireland and that history showed us that the Irish were great fighters and it was something about the temperament. In the House of Lords this September, they were talking about how Ireland needs to either work around its neutrality and rapidly increase military spending or be presented with a bill for defence services provided by Britain. We could do a bill for all the trees and shit you stole over our country. The Irish and British governments are currently working on a defence pact that they hope to have finalised next year. On the Britain-EU level, there are talks in the works that would see Britain pay into the EU budget in exchange for access to the European energy market and access the new funds for EU war preparation. Get Brexit undone, as a friend of mine likes to joke. The fortunes of Britain and the EU are ultimately tied together, it would seem, mainly due to the shared proclivity for delusion that prevails on either side of the English Channel, Almut Rokchowansky has a great article published in Jacobin on Thursday this week. In it, she tries to make sense of the logic behind the war preparation overdrive and the EU obsession with keeping the war in Ukraine going. She suggests that not fully understanding the US moves to rejig their previous policy of American primacy, European elites are committing economic self-harm and debasing themselves, expecting that the reward, continuous vicarious enjoyment of American primacy, is worth the steep price. Alternatively, she writes, some Europeans fantasize about a freestanding European hegemony outside of America's shadow. As the world's third great power, Europe has form. The British saw the colonization of the world as the white man's burden, the French as their mission civilisatrice, and the Germans, less famously, claimed the German essence could heal the world. Today, the EU serves both as a plane for projecting delusions of supremacy and as a bureaucratic machine for acting on them. The fact of the matter is that in both Ireland and Wales, in or out of the European Union, we will be caught up in the twisted logics of these incompetent, delusional, supremacist forces on a warpath that will destroy Europe. And Gito had the same quote that I'm about to read now, but last night. As communists, we understand, like James Connolly did, that nationalism without socialism will never bring independence. In his 1897 essay, Nationalism and Socialism, Connolly wrote, if you remove the English army tomorrow and hoist the green flag over Dublin Castle, unless you set about the organisation of the Socialist Republic, your efforts will be in vain. England will still rule you. She would rule you through her capitalists, through her landlords, through her financiers, through the whole array of commercial and individualist institutions she has planted in this country and watered with the tears of our mothers and the blood of our martyrs. Given the balance of forces at the present conjuncture, it is one of the primary tasks of communists to fight back against the senseless rush to war that is gathering steam in Europe, to organize debate and educate in order to end the escalation and expose the threat of the arms race, and ultimately to find a path to peace. Even if we fail in this effort and war returns to Europe, the effort itself will go some way to help us prepare for the tumultuous times that will come and for the possible opportunities that will naturally spill out from such an upheaval. Thank you.